go through in the next 45 minutes. So let's start on it. The whole idea of being able to do the history of Christianity in 45 minutes is we'll just do the best. The Gospels. We don't have anything written about the Jesus story for quite a while, primarily because they literally thought that he was coming back right away. He said that he would be returning, and so they thought that he was going to be any day now. Didn't realize what returning meant. Mark is the first gospel to be written around 40 or 50 AD. Then we have Matthew and Luke, who are copying off of Mark. And there's another gospel which has never been found. It's called Q. And Q stands for the word Quella in Germany, which means the source. So there's another source. And seeing how it's never been found at this point, it probably never will be found. And then there's John, which is a different gospel altogether. The first three are called the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which tell pretty much the Jesus story. John is different, it's more poetic. When I had to study ancient Greek, which you did in seminary and then in graduate school as well, what we studied essentially was John, because John was the easiest to read in Greek. It was Koine Greek, not the same Greek as we have today. The letters are the same, but nobody would speak it. John doesn't have the parables that we find in the other Gospels. John also kind of has his own axe to grind, which is a little different than some of the others' Gospels. The first person who really sees to it that we begin to have a Bible, first of all, is St. Augustine. Not St. Augustine. I'm sorry. Our Roman Constantine, who, as you know, the early Christians were all being persecuted up until the time of Constantine. He converts to Christianity. He's about to go into a battle. He has a visionary experience in which he sees a cross in the skies. Now, and it's interesting, this whole bit about the sword. He says, in this sign you will conquer. And a sword, if you hold it and look at it, it's a cross, right? And actually, if you just close your eyes, it's not at all hard to see a star when you're meditating, right? A cross. It's obviously one of the most basic symbols that we would have anyway. It's very simple. Constantine takes it as a sign that he's to go into this battle kind of as a Christian. Of course they win, and this leads him to the conviction that Christianity is right. He doesn't force Christianity on folks, though. That doesn't happen until Theodosius. If you go looking on your first page there, you see Theodosius is 347 to 395 as the emperor of Rome. He's the first one to then requires the conversion on the right-hand side on the left, bottom, right-hand side on the left, on the right-hand side on the right-hand side. He's the one that constitutes the Nicene Creed as something that you're going to be saying on a regular basis. It's also during the same time that we have the development of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a very different approach. It's much more mystical. The Course in Miracles is much more of a Gnostic document. Gnostic document meaning, like the Course, it says, you too could have revelation, you too could see what I saw, you could remember the truth of God that's inside you. As the church begins to become solidified, the church becomes the interpreter of the tradition. So it's what the church says that is what you do. Let's keep in mind that at this early point, most people couldn't read. What is written in Latin, and the only people that can read Latin are either the clergy or lawyers, one of the two. In fact, I think it's interesting, in the Catholic Church, the Mass was performed in Latin until 1965, before it was converted. So people didn't even know what was being said, but it seemed like it was holy. You know, it was holy because it was in this other kind of language that you were hearing it being spoken. The Dark Ages are really a very, very difficult time in the early church. I'm just going to skip over this so very, very quickly here. My students, when I used to teach on the university level, would get upset with me. I give them so much work. And I would say, well, you don't have to know all this. This is just an outline. Read this over on your own. And you can read it on your own later on. Let's talk a little bit about the Crusades. The First Crusade is in 1096. Pope Urban II begins the Peasants' Crusade. It says that anyone who will go to Jerusalem and kill the Turks would, upon death, receive immediate entrance into heaven. And God had given, said the Pope, special dispensation to overlook the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And although the Muslims were in charge in Jerusalem at the time, they lived openly with the Jews and the Christians. In fact, when the Crusades started, the Muslims protected the Jewish people who lived in Jerusalem at the time, tried to protect them. The Crusades were just literally bloody awful. There's three events in history that kind of parallel each other in terms of being it's hard to find a word, despicable. The Crusades are one. We figured at least 4 million people were killed during the Crusades. And we're talking about 6 different Crusades that occurred over the period of really of a couple hundred years. The idea was to go to Jerusalem, get Jerusalem back from the Muslims who were in charge of the area at the time. Looking on the bottom of page 2 here, the head of the crusade, Duke Alfred of Lyon, took 60,000 people with him. People sold everything that they had to join the crusade. They were promised that they could have all the booty that they wanted to bring home after the Crusades. This was, after all, a holy war, so it was justified. And when they got to Jerusalem, just everyone was killed. Muslim, Jews, Christians, women, children. It was said that there were piles of heads and soldiers walking in pools of blood that were, in some cases they said knee deep. I can't imagine knee deep, but we'll say ankle deep. They were literally, they didn't have supplies, so they would literally eat the dead. There's a second crusade in 1147 to 1149. They weren't well supplied, so on the way to Jerusalem, they would just sack the cities that they came across and take whatever booty even the Christian city, Zachara, which was a Christian city, was also sacked just for the booty that they could get from it. One of the Crusades was headed up by Richard I of England, the lion-hearted, who is, by the way, of all the kings of England, the one who spent the least amount of time in England, because he was always off on a crusade. There was the Children's Crusade of 1212, which was really an unfortunate experience. They started 30,000 children and adults from France, and another 7,000 from Germany joined this crusade. They never got to the Holy Land. Most of them died on the way from either starvation or disease. Many of them that did kind of wind up getting into that area were captured and taken, sold into slavery, and became slaves. During the same time in Europe, in France in particular, and other places, we find the beginning of the ghosts of the Cathars, the Beggards, and the Penguins. What happened was so many men and young men, older and younger men, had gone on the Crusades that women were left alone. And seeing how the women were left alone, they began to form their own communities. They just naturally joined together in their own communities, but also living somewhat outside of the property of the church. So they began their own ways of worshiping, if you will, some of which began to look a little bit like pagan traditions, you know, natural, native worship kind of stuff that was going on. The Cathars was a religious sect with Gnostic leanings, which appeared in France from the 11th through the 13th centuries. They believed in living this very simple life and trying to follow the teachings of Jesus. They thought that the church had become corrupt. Pope Innocent III launched a crusade against them to destroy them. The way he did it is that he told the French noblemen that if they would go and kill the Cathars, that they could have the land. And so, with his permission. And so, of course, they went and did just that and took the land. Then we find the Beggars and the Penguins. I guess I may not be pronouncing these right. Also developing about the same time, a little bit later, during the 13th and the 14th century. This was a community who lived without vows or creeds or special clothing. They escaped the same kind of persecution that the Cathars had experienced, but were still, I mean, they weren't killed, but were regarded as heretics nevertheless. We no more than finish the Crusades than the Inquisition starts. The Inquisition begins, the first is around 1184 with a trial of ordeals. There's just so many of these, and again, we found the only thing that compares to this is the Holocaust in terms of its severity. The Crusades, the Inquisition, and the Holocaust are the three horrific events in human history. One of the strange things is that every once in a while you also find a real positive spiritual development occurring, and let's talk about just one of these, a bright light. A bright light that occurred during this time is St. Francis of Assisi. So let me just share a little bit about St. Francis of Assisi's life. He was born in 1181 or 1182, we're not sure which, doesn't matter. He dies in 1226, so he didn't get to be very old. He was only 45 years old when he died. A little bit about his background. His father was a wealthy cloth merchant who actually spent a great deal of time in France buying silks or whatever he could get from France, bringing them to Italy to be sold. He was a wholesaler rather than a retailer. One of the things that was very popular at the time was becoming a knight. And if you were a young man, I mean, keep in mind this is still the time of the Crusades, so the knights are still around. And in the early, late teens, early 20s, St. Francis was fascinated with becoming a knight. He became a knight. He was a knight for a day. He could qualify as a knight because he had money. He had the money to buy a horse and the armament and the things that were needed on the part of a knight, because he was a little bit higher class citizen than the others. We get the impression of St. Francis, by the way, his very early years, he was kind of a playboy. He was often throwing parties. Everybody liked him because he had money to throw parties with. But the first night that he was a knight, that night, he had a dream. And in the dream, an angel appears to him and sort of says, "What are you doing? You know, I need you to help save my church." And Francis is so moved by this dream that he gives the horse to another soldier. He gives away his knight's outfit. He makes a total conversion. He gives up even wearing clothes. He's listening one day to the scriptures being read in a church, and he hears this passage where Jesus says, you know, go out and teach, heal the sick and help the poor. Don't take a staff with you. Don't take a purse with you. Don't take anything with you. And he takes this very, very literally. And so he goes out kind of on his own, trying to help people. He's in one church one day, and he's below a crucifix, and he hears Jesus speak to him from the crucifix, and Jesus says, save my church, or repair my church. He takes it literally. He starts going around to different churches, volunteering his time to work on fixing up the church, patching it, doing whatever work needs to be done on it. He's so pious that people begin to notice right away that this guy is really something different. He's a very little guy. He's probably not much more than about 5 foot tall. Goes barefooted around wherever he goes. But his level of commitment and sincerity is so deep that it gets noticed. He begins to collect a band of followers. A lot of people think that they're just crazy, kind of like heretics. So they decide that they have to get permission to form an order. So there we have orders like the Benedictines and the Dominicans, etc. So St. Francis and his little band of 11, so that made 12. Later the tradition is that there were 13. That got changed so then it looked like the 12 disciples, right? So they go to see the Pope, and you get this impression that here they go to see the Pope, and this ragged little guy wearing kind of sackcloth comes in, goes up, asks the permission to form a religious order, and the Pope is kind of like, I don't think so. And that night the Pope has a dream. And this is the center dreams that play a very important role here for the folks, right? And in this dream, the Pope sees this ragged little man come up and holding up the side of St. Peter's Cathedral, which is falling over. So he gets, this ragged little guy is holding it up, is supporting it, right? So he interprets that means that St. Francis is really going to be a supporter of the church. And he is, by the way. He becomes quite a supporter of the church. Despite the objections of some of the cardinals, the Pope grants permission. He says, but you know, you got to have a rule. And you sort of get this impression that St. Francis says, okay, we got to have a rule. and he sort of dashes off into another room, takes the equivalent of a grocery bag, and writes out the rules. And the rules are nobody's to own anything, that they're to live incredibly simply, that the only way that to get a living is to beg for a living, etc., right? And that they're to heal the sick, to do whatever they can, right? He brings the rule back, and the Pope says, well, it's got to be a little bit better than that. But okay, they gets permission. More and more, he grew so quickly. I mean, he died when he was only 44, 45 years old, but his order developed so that in his own lifetime, it had already spread into Spain, into France, and even into the Scandinavian countries before he died. So it was a very, very, very rapid development. They saw it as a renewal of the spiritual depth, that was the real kind of spiritual depth that they needed. He goes on the Crusades. He actually went on the Crusades thinking that he would become a martyr. But unlike the others, he did not wear a sword. He wouldn't carry a sword with him. And it was actually said that he was the first Christian that the Ottomans had seen that wasn't carrying a sword. And he went across the lines. He crossed the line, spent 8 days talking to the Ottoman Turks, trying to get peace. He wanted to establish peace. It didn't succeed, but he oppressed them nonetheless with his sincerity. While he's there, he contracted some sort of eye disease, which he never was able to get free of. He comes back, his eyes watered for the rest of his life. He's always carrying a handkerchief to wipe his eyes, to wipe the water from his eyes. I'm getting along into him, and I don't want to get too much along into him. There was a lot of controversy that came up about how they were to observe the rules. When he came back from the Crusades, one of his rules is that people were to live so simple, they were just to live in stick huts. But when the order began to develop into the colder regions, stick huts weren't good enough. You know, they had to have brick houses and warm clothes that they would wear, etc. So it's been a constant process of development for the Franciscans. But you know, the Franciscans are still important today. We find many of our San Francisco is named for St. Francis. So is Santa Fe. New Mexico is named for St. Francis. Santa Clara is named for St. Clare, who was the St. Clare that became the women's part of the Franciscan equivalent. I'm just saying that here's a bright light that developed. He really did, we believe, get the closest to the example of what the life of Christ had been like, right? And you probably know he's a great lover of nature, great lover of animals. When you see statues of St. Francis, it's always with animals around him, on him, etc. That's just a bright light. Let's go back. We'll go back into the dark. During this, about the same time, a little bit later, we find the development of the scholastics. So the scholastics would include people like St. Thomas of Aquinas, who becomes really the great father of the church. It's interesting, St. Thomas of Aquinas, you may know, 6 months before he died, had a profound mystical experience, after which he said that the Summa Theologica, all these writings that he'd come up with, were just like so much straw in comparison to this religious experience that he'd had. The Catholic Church is built on that straw. I mean, it's the basic doctrine for the Catholic Church to this day. And I'm sure that in Brooklyn we have St. Thomas Aquinas school. There are a lot of St. Thomas Aquinas schools around the country.
Could you say a little more on the straw?
About the straw?
Yeah, I mean,
Well, it's just that all of the theological arguments and the proofs for the existence of God and the logic and the reasoning and all that stuff, that he was a scholastic. He based a lot of what he did on the works of Aristotle and the Greek philosophers. But he just said that it was all intellectual nothingness compared to the actual experience of God, is all he's saying.
But
Yes?
but that theology has been held too as, I mean, they didn't make that transition that he did personally himself.
Oh, no, goodness, no,
Yeah.
no.
yeah.
So.
No, he's the only one who made the transition. You know, they held on to
Yeah.
to all of his writings.
That's
Right?
right.
During this time, the church is becoming progressively corrupted. It becomes the largest landowner in Europe. At one point, the Catholic Church owned a third of all the land in Europe. They got the land, and sometimes they would just take it. But also people would give their land to the church when they died, thinking that was going to help them to get into heaven by doing this good deed. Also, the monasteries started becoming very wealthy. In part, the people were so busy working and trying to stay alive. They would pay the monks and the priests to pray for them. So you would give money so that I got to go work in the field. Here, take this money and please pray to God for me. And so they would do that.
What is that word called?
What word? Oh, you mean the I know where you're going. I'll think of it in a second. Right. Indulgences. Indulgences. And the selling of indulgences became a primary methodology for the church to raise money. Let's go ahead and start talking about the Protestant Reformation. There are few events in history that you can point to a day and say it started that day, but there is in the case of the Protestant Reformation. There was a lot of discontent that was growing on the part of the people with the church because of the extensive corruption that was going on. There were popes prior to the Protestant Reformation who held orgies in the Vatican. I mean, that's the level, especially the Medici popes, who bought the position. They weren't religious. They acquired the position with money and with power. And the Vatican had an army. It was just sort of kind of as far away as you could get from the teachings of Jesus. People were growing very dissatisfied, but there was nothing you could do. I mean, after all, there was this Inquisition. If you stood up to the church, you were in big trouble. If you look at people like Giordano Bruno, who stands up to the church and gets burned at the stake, literally hundreds of thousands were burned at the stake if they opposed the church. Eventually it all falls apart, in particular with one man who you know, Martin Luther, and it happens on one day. That day was October 31st, 1517. Did you ever see that show on television called Man, Moment, Machine? That's sometimes on, well, I don't know whether they've ever done this Man, Moment, Machine, but there's a Luther, they could do Man, Moment, Machine. There's a machine that made Luther famous. And you probably know what it was the printing press. Gutenberg prints the first Bible in 1445, all right? So here's 1445. Now here's Martin Luther in 1517. So by that time the printing press has been pretty well developed. We got movable type. All that Martin Luther did, he was a monk, but he was a very bright one. He was a really intelligent one. He came up with what they called the 95 Theses. What the 95 Theses were, the 95 Theses were questions. And all he said was, look, let's talk about these things. Let's talk about these questions. These are questions I have. Is the selling of indulgences right? That was one of the questions. Should we really be doing this? Actually, what really brought Martin Luther to the fore on this was he's in northern Germany. He was helping to collect money for the church, and he was given the job of taking this money to Rome. When he took the money down to Rome, it was not till he got there that he saw the incredible opulence of, say, St. Peter's. He saw everything as being inlaid in marble and granite and gold and silver, and he thought the money was being given to the poor. And so this sort of, wait a minute, I thought we were collecting this money for charitable purposes. It's being used instead to build up St. Peter's Cathedral. Has any of you ever been to Rome, to St. Peter's? If you see it, it is just,
Yes.
it's opulence beyond reasonableness. It's just so incredible. That was my first impression when I was there, and as a young man. I was just all the marble and the gold and the ivory. And, well, anyhow, when he goes back to Germany, he goes back very disturbed with what he'd seen. If he hadn't made that trip to Rome to take them the money, this might not have happened. So he puts the 95 Thesis on the church door in Wittenberg. Rather than getting into a discussion, what happens instead is that he's brought up on trial, as you probably know. And the trial, and it's quite interesting, it's held in the city of Worms, as you probably know, or Worms, and it's called a diet. So we like to make fun of the fact that it is the diet of worms, the diet of worms. Martin Luther is convinced that he is going to wind up on the stake, just like everybody else ahead of him who questioned the church. But the reason he was saved, whereas the others were burned at the stake, first of all, he's in northern Germany. It's quite a ways away from Rome. And the local political princes are not happy about having to send all their resources down. They don't like what's going on either. So he has support in a way that the others didn't have support. He's found guilty, of course, but then after the trial, he is literally kidnapped by his friends and taken to a monastery church where they hide him away until things can kind of cool off for a while. And while he's there, he translates the Bible the New Testament into German. That is still the Bible, which is read in the German church to this day, is the Luther's translation of the Bible from the Greek into the German. But it really sparks the whole Protestant Reformation, because what he was thinking, a lot of other people were thinking as well. So once the gate kind of is open, it opens all over the place. But it opens in a way that Luther did not want it to see it open. It opens bloodily. It opens with revolutions. It opens with with battles, with peasants going up against, it's interesting what we see going on like in the Middle East right now.
Yeah.
It just gets to the point where the people say enough, we can't keep going this way. But we go through a really terrible period of 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, the Peasants' War, all these people being killed, the Protestants and killing Catholics and Catholics killing Protestants. Let's just talk a moment about the Protestant Reformation as it occurs in England. Very, very different reason. Nothing to do with theology in the same sense that it was with Luther. It's really because of King Henry VIII, as you probably know, who wants to divorce his wife, and the Pope will not give him permission, so he just takes over. He makes himself head of starts a new church called the Church of England, makes himself head of the Church of England, raids the monasteries, takes all their silver and gold and to support his efforts. This is not a new story, right? And then establishes the Church of England, which looks a lot like, he actually died a Catholic, which is sort of, and actually prior to all this, he was given the title Defender of the Faith. So he was really a good Catholic. It's just that he needed to have this thing done that the church wouldn't do. There was a lot of really strange things happening at this time. The libertarians came in. This was a whole movement with sexual liberality, for one thing, especially in France, because they just kind of threw religion out altogether. So the hell with it. None of it made any sense. So we could do whatever we wanted to. And then, what happens is we kind of go back and forth in terms of liberality, conservative, and then it goes back to liberal and back to conservative. So the Quakers, for example, kind of come out as a revolt against the liberality that was going on at the time. No. What we need is just be quiet and peaceful and inner searching and inner processes that can go on inside us. Let's just look briefly at the major Protestant denominations that come out of this. The Methodists, start with John Wesley, actually here, mostly, although it starts in England, it's mostly here in the United States. The birth of Methodism is almost parallel with the birth of the United States. That's why in every little town around in New England, you can find a little Methodist church, because they were supported by circuit riders who went around from little church to little church. John Wesley did not want to start a church. The word Methodist comes from methodical, meaning the methodical study of the Scriptures. So we were going to study the Scriptures. On his deathbed, John Wesley was saying, "Don't do it. Don't turn this into a church." But it was too late. It became a church, right? As opposed to what we would say with the Course in Miracles, it's a study. The original intention was to study the Scriptures. It was a group of people who were studying the Scriptures, not to right. All right. Presbyterians. Let's look at where the word comes from. The word Presbyterian comes from the way that the church is run. It's called a presbytery. A presbytery is the organizational group that run the church. Right? That really comes out of Calvinism. It really comes out of Switzerland. It becomes one of the major denominations here in the United States. Then we find the evangelicals that begin to occur. A lot of them are growing up here in the United States. We have some Mormonism, of course, as you know, is native to the United States. I want to look at this Religion in America sheet. Can we look at this before we go to break for lunch? This is very, very interesting, especially as an interfaith group, because it says a lot about where we stand today. I suppose you know that traditional Christianity is dying very rapidly here in the United States. It's like 1% per year. That's very, very rapid, 1% per year. The church that I grew up in, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, was at one point the 7th largest congregation in the United States. They lost 60% of their membership in the past 60 years. So it's right in there with that 1% per year, right? It peaked in the early 1960s. I just read an article recently on Methodism and how much trouble they're losing 1,000 members per week in the Methodist Church in the United States. Right? So let's look at some of these statistics. For example, in 1990, 86% of Americans, and you can find all these statistics, by the way, on BeliefNet, on the Pew Forum, and USA Today runs annual statistical reviews on this information. In 1990, 86% of Americans identified themselves as Christian, but only 20% of that number actually went to church. So people would identify, if on a survey, what are you? I'm a Christian, but as far as church attendance, only 20% of that number. By 2000, 76% of Americans identified themselves as Christian. So that's a drop of 10%. Right in there, it's 1% per year loss, right? But only 18% of that actually attended church, right? The United States was at one time a dominantly Protestant country. It is now becoming a minority Protestant country. The largest group of people in the United States now, when asked their religious affiliation, say that they are nuns. Not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E. None. They don't have a major religious affiliation. The hardest hit are the mainline Protestants, Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterian, Congregationalists, United Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, etc. Although I must say that the Catholics are also probably even hit harder than some of the mainline Protestants. Of course, this is largely due to the problems with sexual abuse, but also the hard line stance that the Catholic Church has taken in its refusal to ordain women. I remember in 1994, I don't know why I remember the year, but I had stopped, I was on my way into the city to our church services that we had for interfaith, and there was headlines in the newspaper at a little grocery store I stopped in. The headlines read, "The Pope says there will never be women priests." All right? Now, that's practically 20 years ago that happened, but that's still the stance. Right? What has saved the Catholic Church in good part, but it's not completely, has been the influx of Latinos into the United States. Because Latinos, as they come into the United States, have largely been Catholic. That is now changing as well. A lot of the Latinos are leaving the Catholic Church, and it's interesting where they're going. They are going primarily to the evangelicals, and the Pentecostal Church in particular has been taking in a lot of Latinos. They've also engaged in a pretty large evangelical movement into Latin America, South America, into Spanish-speaking countries. So that then it comes back up into the United States as well. There's a very interesting statistic, as you can see on here on the this right-hand column of this first page. Islam is the second largest religion in the world, as you know. It's the second largest non-Christian religion in the United States, and it's growing very rapidly. You notice that if things continue the way they are right now, this is a very interesting statistics, by the year 2050, Islam will be the major religion in the United States. We find that there are very, very few people under the age of 30 who have any religious affiliation at all. They're the biggest group of nuns that they are. As this nun category grows, their children in turn are nuns.
Maybe.
Right? Pardon?
Maybe.
Maybe. Yeah, well, I mean, it's just as things stand at the moment. I think we're in a really sort of exciting time in that, although I've got the statistics, I think, on the next page here. Let's look at the upside. First, let me mention something about the reason for the decline. John Shelby Spong, whom I showed, many of you know, is a well-known Episcopal priest, John Shelby Spong, who was the Episcopal Bishop of New Jersey, says that he thinks that the primary reason for the death of the church is that the church has failed to really nourish people. It's really the tradition just is not enough. They're really looking for something more than that. On the upside, we are experiencing an increasing incidence of what we call spirituality. While church attendance is low, 53% of all Americans say they are spiritual, and the spirituality is an important part of their life. This compares with only 16% in Britain, 14% in France. Actually, the death of the church, as you see it manifest in Europe, is much worse than it is here. There are churches in England that are practically empty on Sunday mornings. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but some of the exceptions are the ones that are either deeply involved in community activities, for example. That's one thing that helps to keep a church alive, like the church that you were part of when you were growing up, or some of the evangelical churches. People think, well, the churches are going to, they see the churches on TV and all they're doing, but that only counts for 1% of the population in the United States that are involved in what we call mega churches. Mm-hmm. The really, really big churches. They look like they're significant largely because they own television networks. You know,
Like John Hagee?
Yeah, those guys. You know, they can afford to be there, right? So they get their support that way. A lot of churches are changing, they're dropping the word church. I have a list of some of them that have done that. The religious science has stopped using the word church. They're now religious science centers.
Unity as well.
Unity as well.
Oh, really? Just as unity.
Yeah, it's beginning to change. It's becoming centers. There's a stigma around church, which is not surprising. The Crystal Cathedral, in case you don't know, the big church out in California, went bankrupt a couple of years ago. They were like $50 million in debt. They sold out actually to the Catholic Church, because there's a lot of Latinos that live in that area who were able to continue to support the church for them. Mormonism, you might think, was growing because they have a very strong evangelical program, but they're actually not. I think a statistic here, in 1990, there were about 8% of the world was Mormon. By 2010, it's 2.5%. So that's, I want to show you this, can you hold this?
Sure.
There's that chart I brought in, I just want to show that briefly and then we'll take our break for lunch.
I just got an article about
Back there.
Yeah, wherever it is. Yes, Emily, you were saying?
I just read an article
You can help me
that
do this.
the very same issue around women has totally undermined the Boston congregation,
Yeah.
and is one of the number one reasons that Mormons did not vote for Romney.
Oh, yes.
Number one reason what? I didn't vote.
They didn't vote.
All right, let me show you this map. I think it's 60 years old. But despite the fact that it's 60 years old, it gives you a little feeling for religion in the United States. I'll explain the basic difference. This is every county in the United States by religion, okay? If it's a solid color, it means that more than 50% of the people in that county are this particular, like red is Catholic, right? So more than 50% of the people who, and see, this is the big, this is,
Texas?
right, this is Texas, so this is the whole, remember, we should be coming up from the south, right? Blue is Baptist, okay? You've heard of the Bible Belt? Well, this is pretty clear, this is where the Bible Belt is, right? Now, if it's striated, which it means that it's half blue and half white, then it's only 25% of that county is of that particular religion, but it's the largest religion in that area, right? If it's pure white up here, like if we see a few white ones, then there's no count, there's no religion which gets up to 25%. So there's no majority in the area. The yellow is Methodist.
Interesting.
You can sort of see how the red is largely in the cities, the coastal cities. Louisiana, New Orleans is red. Southern Texas into Mexico is red. Gray is Mormon. Now, if there's the changes that I would say essentially that have occurred on this map are.
Excuse me, but the pink is Protestant?
Pink. No, it's Catholic, but
It's Catholic too. Okay.
right.
What's green?
Green is Lutheran. Okay, so we really should be, sort of see this. This is the whole. This is where the Swedes, the Norwegians. We got the Norwegian accent up here in North Dakota and South Dakota. This is Episcopalian.
Where is that? You point to that again.
What state?
It's somewhere it's in Wyoming.
There's no people in
Now there'd be some of that.
All
as
three
well.
are Episcopalian.
The major difference between this and now is that more of these would not be solid. More of them would be striated. And this, although I said that the Mormons had gone down worldwide, the truth is that this would be more gray. And there'd probably more of Idaho, more of Wyoming, more up in this area. They probably have more and more and more into this area here.
And down into Nevada too.
Where's Judaism in that?
Well, keep in mind, the statistics on Judaism are in the piece of paper.
1%.
Judaism accounts for 1%.
Nothing, except in New York.
And if there's one religion that's dominant in this white area, then that initial will be there for that. There's one county on this map that's got a J on it.
New York.
In New
You want to
York,
guess what
City.
It is not New York City.
Really?
Florida, Miami.
No.
Where?
It's very near here.
Brooklyn? Jersey?
New Jersey?
Sullivan.
Oh,
Oh, Catskills.
Yes.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yes.
So there's the
Sullivan
Bible
County.
Belt
It's
and
right-
Borscht Belt.
It's
Yeah.
right there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Sullivan County's got this, the only,
Still?
there
But this is
are,
19.
No.
there are more than 1 million Jews who live in New York.
Emily,
But-
can you point to Sullivan County there?
Oh, yeah, Sullivan County's right, yeah, where
Okay.
Emily's got her
See, when I'm
finger.
zoomed in, I can't see your finger, and then I gotta zoom out, and then I gotta find your finger again, so.
Right.
Don't lose your finger.
Okay, I'll tell you when you can.
So I just think it's just sort of a fun kind of map to look at.
Okay,
We're gonna
great.
take our break for, what?
Whoops.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Congregationalists are all mostly up in here. What did you start
I was
saying?
gonna say Protestants, I don't get that, I don't get why there isn't that. And also, where's Islam? In 1950, there was none, and now you're saying that.
I don't know that there's
2050,
any, yeah, I don't know
It's
that
gonna be-
there's a dominant area yet. I don't know
There's
how much
no
difference
color
it is.
for non-affiliated spiritual
Just-
folk.
Right. Buddhism, as you probably know, is the largest, fastest growing Eastern religion
Uh-huh.
in the United States.
And of course, there are a million yoga centers now.
Right.
Which accounts for the interest in the word spirituality.
Speaking of, if you want to ask about Judaism, Judaism accounts for less than 1% of the U.S. population. That figure is rapidly declining, primarily due to intermarriage. 42% of the Jews in the world live in Israel. 40% live in the United States. And of that, 1 million are in New York City. And then the rest of the world. But there's like only 1,000 in Japan.
Would you say that religion
This is
is
very-
dying then? On the way up?
Traditional religion is, yes.
Traditional is dying.
Um,
Moribund.
Larry passed around an email about this new book called Interspiritual.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're going to be seeing more and more. There's more and more interspiritual, interfaith.
This is
We
growing
are
on
actually
the move.
on the growing edge of what's really, really happening. And it's inevitable that more and more people will be identifying themselves as interfaith in terms of their perspective. When I was admitted to the hospital a few months ago for some reason, they said, and I said, interfaith. Because,
Doesn't matter.
yeah,
Whichever.
it seemed like the most appropriate answer, you know.
I had one friend refer to something in an email after he saw that book, Kurt Johnson's book that's coming out. He said, "Oh, I'm so excited by the new religion, and I can't believe you're studying that in school." I said, "I've never really heard it referred to as the new religion." you
It's
know.
not a religion.
And he said, "Well, I just mean the new movement in spirituality," and that was his phrase for it, you know.
Yeah. All right, it's 10 after 1. We'll break for
Okay.
Can
lunch.
somebody tell me who Ken Wilber and Rhonda Byrne are?
Yes, Ken Wilber is a Buddhist who lives in Boulder, Colorado, who's really regarded as one of the major writers on Buddhism today. And I don't know what the other one was.
Rhonda Byrne, isn't she involved with the...
Rhonda Byrne is the one who did The Secret.
The Secret.
Oh.
Right. Actually, you may want to look. It'll be coming out soon. Every year in January, Watkins, which is the largest metaphysical bookstore in London, produces a list of what they regard as the 100 most influential spiritual leaders in the world.
Living?
Living. In fact, so it changes every year because like 3 died of the 100 last year. So there'll be 3 or 4 that'll probably die this year. That'll come back. It's very. They actually the thought that anybody could do this, but they still do it. It's based on their influence in the world in terms of things like how often their name appears on the internet, how often it's Googled, how many books they've got out, or how many books they've said, whether or not they've done anything that is socially significant. So you know, the Dalai Lama's on there, Desmond Tutu's on there, Marianne Williamson's on there, Oprah Winfrey's on there.
Eckhart Tolle.
Yeah, right. So take a look at it. Just go on the internet. Just look Watkins Review. I don't know whether the 2013. I doubt if the 2013 list is out yet.
I have a piece of information that I just found amazing. I went to buy a Bible for a friend for Christmas present to the American Bible Society, and they don't sell Bibles anymore.
Really?
Amazing.
Yeah, for 2 days
So
now.
where did
And I
they
arrived 2 days
recommend
later.
that you buy one?
Online.
Online.
Uh-huh.
Right. Of course.
So I went to Barnes & Noble, which was fun.
They would-
But it just interested me that the American Bible Society
Doesn't so
no
well.
longer.
Well, that's more of a trend in retail and brick and mortar versus online than really a trend in
Yeah,
religion
but it's still,
itself,
but it's interesting that they don't
still-
feel the need to have Bibles from
I
people
know, and
coming
we've
in.
got Namaste Bookstore, you could probably get a few versions.
Yeah.
Yes, Reverend Emily's going to give us a little prayer before lunch.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Great Spirit, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to that eternal life. Amen.
Amen. Of course, the prayer of St. Francis. John, I've got to ask after that, at what point during his, life did St. Francis actually write that?
Oh, I don't know when he wrote that, but of course he's most well known for it. Of course, that's
Yeah.
also can be sung now as well. Beautiful.
It just must have been so radical at the time of the Crusades.
St. Francis had when he died, he's the first person to come up with the creche idea. He performed his own funeral. He was dying, and he knew that he was dying. He asked all of his clothes be taken off. His body was rubbed down with ashes, and they were just gathered around him praying as he left this world.
And he then did
Wow.
I think he was.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Huh?
I think he was lying on the floor,
Yeah,
like the cross, because he wanted to be as close to Jesus.
right.
Well, it seems great. Very.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, so we'll go along.
We'll see you at 2:30.